So here we are in week 4, and the aim of today's session is to give you a guide as to how to prepare and assemble a systematic review. So if you yourself are doing a systematic review for your dissertation, then this session will be incredibly useful. It will feature a demo, so basically you can watch me start to assemble a systematic review as if you were looking over my shoulder. So a demonstration. And if you aren't doing a systematic review, still a useful session to have a run through. This video, where it's an MP4, so you can just run through at your own pace, and focus on the parts that you choose to. So still be of use to everyone, but specifically if you're doing a systematic review, this session is definitely for you. So the session is split up into 3 main parts, and obviously the first part, where normally you may have noticed that we do some sort of link to previous week. This week kind of stands alone more so, in that we'll start off straight away with guidance on what makes a systematic review systematic, why we do them, why we need them, why they're so essential, and how to do one. I'll demonstrate that in the second part of the session. We'll be focused on just highlighting additional resources, sources of help that will assist you in assembling your systematic review. Now, the third part of the session will be a task, which is I normally place that at the beginning, but what I've done in the live sessions, which I also run as the recorded session that you've got here, is instead of placing that in the beginning, because we only have 1 hour, I've got that at the end. Now, this session might well take a touch over 60 minutes that we normally have. Either that, or I'll include it in a separate MP4 file, posted on Canvas, giving you some directions as to what the task involves for next week. But without further ado, how to do a systematic review. Rhyme unintended. So why do we do a systematic review? Well, all the way through this presentation and all the way through your assembly of your own systematic review, always keep this quote at the forefront of your mind. So a review is only as good as the studies it contains. Now, that counts if you're doing a systematic review or if you yourself are doing a critical review. So the studies that you select, that really determines to a large extent the quality of work you produce. If you've got quite a poor selection of studies, then that means there isn't much more you can do about gathering extra marks from other sources of the marking criteria, pardon me. So why do we do them? Well, to put things into context, remember that research into sport and exercise originated from the field of clinical research. So remember that the first ever piece of scientific research carried out that looked specifically at physical activity was done in the 1950s by Professor Jerry Morris, who noticed that soldiers, men coming back from World War II, those who went into quite active jobs, reintegrated into society quite well, and lived longer. Whereas those who came back and got a job that was quite sedentary and not much sort of physical movement involved, tended to not last as long. And he wanted to find out why, and he was convinced, because he was a cardiovascular consultant. He was convinced that exercise had a significant effect on heart health. Little did he know that decades later we would understand that exercise has an effect on more or less everything in the human body. So remember, what Professor Morris did was he headed down to London, really simple study design. He recruited a load of bus conductors who walked around the bus, double-decker bus in London, you know, the classic red London bus, up and down the stairs all day, very active job. Compared to the bus drivers, who, in comparison, were very inactive. They were seated all day, you know, so sedentary. And what he found was quite remarkable. He just looked at the prevalence, so how often people had heart attacks, and found that the bus drivers who were sedentary had nearly 2.5 times the number of heart attacks that the physically active bus conductors did. Now, you know, some researchers contested these results, but to little effect, because these findings caused an explosion of interest in exercise and sport and its effect on the human body. And it's the reason why today, a few decades later, I think last year we had around 500,000 papers published just in fields relating to exercise. So remember that all that originated from clinical research. Now, we need to have sources of literature that medical professionals can read to enable them to make the correct decisions, because in medicine there's no room for error. So all doctors and nurses and, you know, clinicians should practice what's called evidence-based medicine, which means all of their decisions should be based on the latest and most up-to-date evidence. So a medical professional needs to know if a treatment works and how well it'll work, and in just the same respect, a sports professional needs to know if a training method will work. A good example is the old kind of dichotomy between, is HIIT training more effective than long, slow to moderate intensity cardio? That was an ongoing debate for a long time. Went on a little too long, in my opinion, but certainly the two leading researchers in those fields increased their reputation by a fair bit. But in both of these areas, decisions should be based on evidence. Now, it's not really the job of the medical professional or the sports professional to trawl through hundreds, potentially, of journal articles. It's the job of the researcher to review those journal articles, determine which ones of the evidence base, which ones are most relevant, and include them in a review, publish it, and that forms the evidence from which decisions that I've just mentioned, those decisions are made. So it's the literature that researchers produce which underpin the decisions that doctors, clinicians and sports professionals make. And it's something I remind my friends who are doctors, remind them of that now and then, just when they need to be brought down a peg or two. So you've got systematic review, and the other choice you had for your dissertation was to do a critical review. Now, there are only really two types of review. There's what's called a systematic review, which we'll focus on today, and the other type is just generally in journals called a review paper. So, just a review. All reviews should be critical. Now, we'll compare a review paper and a systematic review. We'll look at the differences and see how they differ. So let's have a look. So this paper is a really good one. It's written by somebody a doctor that I know on a professional basis. Dr. Kirsty Anderson, who is a consultant neurologist based over at the Freeman Road Hospital Sleep Clinic. And the chances are, if you've had or have relatively serious or even a non-serious sleep disorder, then you may well have seen Dr. Anderson. So there's two sleep specialists. There's only two over there. So there's the other one, Sophie West. She's a respiratory specialist. So the chances are, if something like sleep apnea, something related to the respiratory system, you might see Sophie. If it's a sleep disorder related to something like sleepwalking or insomnia, something related to neurology, then you most likely see Kirsty, as she's a consultant neurologist. So this is a review paper. It's in sleep disturbance in mental health problems and neurodegenerative diseases. So two pretty complex areas. What's the structure? That's what we're interested in. Not so much interested in the content, although the content is excellent. So Kirsty's got a really good writing style. I really like it. It's very, very. It flows well, but it's not kind of flowery or full of jargon. It's very, very easy to read. And so it starts off by describing normal sleep physiology, which involves, you've got two main phases of sleep. You've got, when you fall asleep, you go into non-REM sleep, which is just normal sleep, where brain waves gradually slow down, and to the naked eye, just watching somebody sleeping there, they look like they're asleep. That phase has stage one, which is kind of where you're drowsy and you're just drifting off, and often, if you've just been to the gym and you've just had something to eat, if you're sitting upright and you nod off for a second, that you're just entering stage one sleep, and you've got like a stretch reflex in your neck, which that's what wakes you up when you nod. But if you fall asleep, if it's the evening time, you're in bed and you fall asleep, then you'll enter stage one sleep, which is just sort of drowsiness. And then quite quickly after that, about 10 minutes roughly, you'll enter stage 2, which is what we would accept as real sleep. Still pretty light. And then you would enter stage 3 sleep, which we also call deep sleep. And it's called deep sleep because it's where brain waves really have slowed down now. And a lot of restorative processes, a lot of the health benefits take part due to deep sleep. Now, about 90 minutes, very roughly, that is 90 minutes after you've fallen asleep, you've gone through those stages, you'll enter what's called REM sleep, which you'll have heard of before. And REM sleep, it stands for rapid eye movement. REM sleep, if you were to watch somebody sleeping as they enter REM sleep, you wouldn't really notice any difference in terms of what they look like or whether they move or not. They wouldn't. But if we were to watch their brain waves, which you can do pretty easily, just with the use of electrodes, we do that using what's called an electroencephalogram, an EEG, a bit like an ECG for the brain. And your brain waves during REM sleep look almost identical to what they do when you're awake. So the brain it's not awake, but it's very active during REM sleep. During REM sleep, you dream. We all remember a tiny proportion of our dreams. Some people are prolific dreamers and remember a lot of detail. Other people don't remember really much at all. There's no, whichever your kind of category you fall into, it doesn't make any difference. The purpose of dreaming is to sort and arrange memories from that day of when you were awake and conscious. Your brain, through the process of dreaming, organizes those memories into important and non-important memories. And about 90% of what we experience whilst we're conscious is not really important. The brain, a lot of the brain is responsible for filtering out stimuli. So, for example, right now, your brain is filtering out a lot of information, like the sensation of the chair you're sitting in, the sounds of anything outside, if you're hungry or a little bit peckish, or if you're feeling a little bit hot or a little bit cold, all of those, or a little bit tired, all of those things will be filtered out by the brain if something catches your attention anyway and you need to focus. The brain is really good at doing that. So in this review, notice the structure. Describes normal sleep physiology, and then how that physiology differs in certain mental health conditions, primary sleep disorders, and mental health conditions like sleep apnea, which is a very common sleep disorder. You've got various mental health disorders there. And then we go on to look at neurodegenerative diseases. So the process of aging and sleep is interesting. So when we get into our 60s, the way in which we sleep has changed quite a bit. So no longer will you find, when you get to that age, no longer will you find that you sleep in, a chunk of 6 to 9 hours at night time, and then during the day you're awake, the chances are that it'll be far more. So sleep at night will be far more fragmented and broken, and wakefulness during the day will involve a lot of napping, nodding off, that kind of thing. So as we get older and reach older age, then the distinction between wake and sleep is less pronounced. As we continue toward the end of the paper, we talk about Parkinson's disease and some of the more common dementias. Here we can see Lewy body disease, which is tragically what Robin Williams diagnosed with, and the symptoms of that caused him to do what he chose to do at the end of his life. And if you've ever looked into that, the symptoms were starting to get pretty bad, contrary to what the story was in the beginning. So quite sad. So that is a review, or a critical review, you could call it. Notice it's got a narrative structure. It's set out more like a book, where you have sections or chapters, mini chapters you could say these are. Whereas if you compare that to systematic review, oh, not the one I was after. One moment. The one? Okay, I'd made a load of highlights to this document, which have vanished. Not to worry. Okay, so here we've got a systematic review. Just fast forward that part. So this systematic review looks at physical activity levels in pediatric cancer survivors. So basically children who have had treatment for cancer, and they have survived. So they finished their treatment, and are cured. So the introduction is just as you would expect, explains a little bit about the background, summarised the discussion really nicely in paragraph by paragraph. It's given each paragraph a sentence, but so I'll do it in real time, why not? What would you expect to see? Well, obviously the introduction you would expect to see, that's kind of standard. In the method section you would expect to, well, one of the first things you would expect to see is mention of the Prisma statement guidelines, and obviously you need to reference that. And then here you can see in the search strategy subheading, they've used a total of 5 electronic databases. You would be fine just using Medline, PubMed, which is kind of the same thing, PsycInfo, and Cochrane collaboration database. Maybe other things like Sports Discus might be relevant to you. Now, using PICOS criteria, the authors will have come up with search terms that they used. So this is obviously quite an extensive and complex systematic review. So therefore the search terms are extensive, and they've stuck to randomized controlled trials, which is good. I'll explain why in a moment. So you can see how they've used, you see these ands and or, they're called Boolean operators, and again you'll see those as I put my search strategy together for my systematic review, which I'm going to start for you in this video. Here in the section labelled eligibility criteria, it talks a little bit about what the inclusion criteria was. Oh, there we are. But really good idea is to explain in a fair bit of detail who the population where you're interested in, the intervention, any comparisons, the outcome measures, primary and secondary, and the study design. So they focused only on clinical trials, basically. So everything so far pretty standard, what you would expect to see. It explains, who did what. So typically in a systematic review, you have more than one person working on it. So yeah, so when you go through this process over here of involving the Prisma flowchart, the records can be double checked for any errors. But if you do make any errors, don't worry about that. You're only one person, and this is a decent challenge. And then talks a little bit about the data extraction method. I'll show you how to do that, and just explains, obviously, like any paper does, what you see in figure 1, and then the later, figure 2, table 1, yeah, because it's a table format. Yeah, so it just describes all of that, and you definitely need this characteristics of the studies that you ended up with finally, and hopefully it's a nicely manageable number. And just talk a bit about the population, the intervention, the outcome measures, and any effects, and then onto your discussion, and you're home free. So the most challenging part of a systematic review is certainly carrying out the search and then quite a time-consuming part of the review process is excluding the studies which aren't relevant to your research question. So all reviews are not created the same. With a review paper, there's a slight burden on the author that if, let's say, Kirsty here, or Dr. Anderson rather, was to miss out some really important studies, which she wouldn't do, but let's say another researcher did, or you did indeed, then there's a risk that you might, just very innocently and mistakenly, produce a slightly biased argument. And if that was to happen, then yeah, that should be highlighted by whoever marks your work. Whereas with a systematic review, the whole systematic part reduces the risk of missing any studies to the lowest level of risk. Obviously, you can't get a zero chance that you miss any, but it really does lower the risk of missing any important studies there. So I find a lot of students just struggle formulating a research question out of what appears to be lack of confidence. So just put together your research question and from that your search terms. So use PCOS criteria. Your research question shouldn't be too specific, but also shouldn't be too broad. So something like the benefits of exercise, a systematic review. As a title, that would be something far too broad, and alternatively something far too narrow, far too specific would be question like that one. Now, when I decide to start systematic review, this is what task that I first carry out. So you'll notice I've just got a Word document here. So the systematic review that I'm going to start, or I've kind of been, doing little bits and bobs over the last couple of days, is depression and objectively measured physical activity. So basically, what are the activity levels of people with depression? And I'm only including studies where physical activity has been measured using accelerometers or activity monitors. Because from 2010, around about that point, there was a real move in the literature away from using physical activity questionnaires to assess physical activity levels. And because technology became cheaper and more effective and smaller, so it could fit on the wrist nice and easily, then the focus was on using activity monitors because they're just far more accurate and reliable. But when you've got your research question, what you need to do in order to create a list of search terms is identify the key concepts or the key themes within your title or research question. So this one is pretty straightforward. So we've got depression, objectively measured physical activity, and physical activity itself as a behavior. So concept 1 would be depression, concept 2, physical activity, and concept 3 would be the way that physical activity is measured. So just write down as many keywords as possible you can think of that studies have used to describe, in this case, depression, physical activity, and so on. Now, depression is generally, I know this because I'm familiar with the literature, it's generally either people are included who have it or they're not. So it's kind of a yes-no scenario. So in terms of keywords for depression, there aren't any others really that I'd like to include. So something like low mood, that's very different from depression. That's something that is transient, so it just lasts a few days or a few weeks. You do have moderate you have mild depression, and you have moderate to severe depression. But I'm interested equally in the two for now. Concept 2 with physical activity, now obviously a huge synonym, really common word that's used kind of interchangeably with physical activity, is exercise. So therefore I would search for exercise as well as physical activity. In concept 3, where I've got activity monitor as the theme there, then we've got activity monitor. We could have activity monitoring, and quite often the device used, because it contains a sensor called an accelerometer. So you've got an accelerometer in your phone. It's the sensor that detects orientation of the phone. So when you lie on your side and the picture turns, it's the accelerometer that is responsible for that action. Very good at determining not only the speed of movement, but also of static posture. So other words like accelerometer or even accelerometry are widely used in the literature. So I've got a few additional key search terms there. What I would do is go to PubMed and enter them. Now, when you're putting together your research question, obviously you want your search terms, but you want to, if you can, and I say if you can, if it's possible, it's not always possible, you want to try and stay toward the higher parts of the evidence hierarchy. Now, the example I'm going to show you, I do have to delve into cross-sectional studies and lower quality evidence, or a lower level of evidence, could say. My advice to you would be, so I doubt that you've got a burning passion for accelerometers. So when you're choosing something that you're interested in, make it a review of randomized controlled trials. That means bearing in mind that the literature review is only as good as the literature within it. Make it a review of randomized controlled trials, and you've got a literature sort of collection that is of the highest possible quality. And the better the quality of the literature, the easier it is to make very clear conclusions and arguments. If a research question requires the use of low-level evidence, like retrospective cohorts, then it can be a lot more difficult to reach a very clear and unambiguous conclusion. So remember, it's a meticulous approach, the PICOS criteria. That's what makes a review systematic. And that's absent in a narrative review. So make sure you only choose a narrative review if that structure best suits what you set out to achieve. So it's the information within PCOS that just put it together, create some search terms from it, and then get searching. It's this information within PCOS that establishes the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the studies analysed. So I showed you just what I do with, well, it's not what I do, it's what all professionals do when they're putting together a systematic review. So you separate out the key concepts and identify keywords that can be used for each of those concepts. So let's go and have a little demonstration of depression and objectively measured physical activity. Let's see how it's done. Disconnected from the internet. Okay, so I'm going to do something that you know is wrong. Well, hopefully. So if I was to just put depression, the depression physical activity accelerometer, and just click search, you know what would happen. You at least know that it's going to bring up a load of papers that are just not relevant to what I'm looking for. So there we've got a feasibility study in Parkinson's disease. There we're measuring sedentary behaviour. I'm not even interested in that. So why is that? Well, if we go to advanced search, we can see what PubMed has done. So if I click on this arrow here, it shows us what's happened when I've just typed those terms in. Essentially what PubMed has done in response to that search. It's tried to help, but it's a machine, and the algorithm that's used in this search engine is very similar to that which you find in Google. Google's a bit more kind of intelligent, like artificial intelligence kind of thing, but they work on the same principles. And so because I didn't add any of these, you see the ands and the ors, those are Boolean operators, and they tell the search database what to do with the search terms. If you don't add any Boolean operators, then all it'll do is search from left to right. It'll find all studies on depression, then all studies on or featuring the word physical, and all studies featuring the word activity, and then finally all studies featuring the word accelerometer. That's not very helpful at all. On top of that, it's taken the word depression and come up with a load of derivatives that, again, I'm not interested in. I know which studies I'm looking for, and I know that depression is the key word that is used, that will feature most heavily. Physical activity, it's also used exercise, and it hasn't done too bad there, and hasn't done too bad here either. But we use those Boolean operators so that we can get a better quality search. And that's really what it's about. So This is a really good video which I'll embed on Canvas for you. But here, have a look here. You can see exactly what PubMed did. Now, Boolean operators, you could say that they're also known as you saying to the search engine, could you please do X, Y, or Z? So it just helps the search engine find what you need. So first little tip is any term which has more than one word needs to be encased in double quotations rather, like this. So double quotations, and search engine will treat that term as the term physical activity rather than just the word physical and the word activity. Another little tip is that you can shorten words. So this is called truncation. So I mentioned before that I could type in accelerometer, and if I did, I would have to type in accelerometry, because accelerometry is a word that's been used for a number of years to describe the use of accelerometers. Or I could just put an asterisk there, and it would come up with all the words with accelerometer at the front, and then anything that comes after it would include as well. And I happen to know that there's only accelerometer and accelerometry, so just for quickness I did that. But the main Boolean operators are and, or, and not. So if you put and in between two search terms, what you're asking PubMed to do is you're asking it if you could please find all of these terms, thank you. So if I put and in between depression, physical activity, and activity monitor, I'm asking PubMed to find papers that have only used all of those terms. Where we have or, that's where we've got two terms which can be used for the same thing. So like physical activity and exercise. That's where we're asking the search engine to return papers that use either one or the other. Apologies, a little error there. Not any of these topics, but rather to find either one or the other, not both. It's important to use parentheses. That's why I said brackets when I was up here. Important to use brackets or parentheses, whatever you know them by, because so think of your search terms, your list of search terms. When you put them into a search engine, it's kind of like you do the same thing with parentheses like this as you do with an equation in Excel. So you need to put brackets round certain parts of the equation to separate it out. Without those brackets, it would just be a calculation nightmare, a bit of a mess. And so the last Boolean operator you might use is not. And when you ask PubMed to do that, you're basically saying, could you please exclude articles please include articles that do not have this word, or exclude articles that do have this word. A good example would be cancer. So I know that the research shows quite definitively that there's no relationship between exercise, health benefits, and a reduction in the risk of the blood-borne cancers like leukemia, but other cancers of the harder tissues, mainly cancers of the bowel and of the breast, there are pretty strong relationships between physical activity and those cancers. So you could include the search term cancer and then put not leukemia, multiple myeloma, and the other blood-borne cancers, just as an example there. Now, once you've got that original, search result, then this is the kind of thing that will happen. Go into PubMed, then you'll have a well thought out search like this, and here we can see that we've got, when I've carried out this search, it's returned far better selection of papers, and so you can transport all of these results plus the abstract into a text document, and so that enables you to carry out the next section or the next step in this systematic process. So you just click save, and you want the abstract of each paper, but you want it in the format of it'll just come out as a text file. So yeah, you want all the results on this page. You want it in the format of want the abstract of each one in a text file. Create that file. We'll see it appear here. Click and open it. And what I do, and this is, mark my words, I learned this from the best, is just to copy that and put it straight into a Word document. So new document, paste it in there. Now you'll notice that when you've pasted it in, then it might be set out in a way so you've got big gaps between the lines, and so what I do is spend a little bit of time, because I'm going to have to read through all of these and decide which ones I'm going to get rid of, which ones I'm going to keep. So it's something I need to be careful doing. So I generally have a little fiddle around, put it into a font that's easier to read, make sure it's single spaced, so there's no dead space that I've got to draw my eye down through the page. And all you do is hand sort. So let's do a few. Ecological momentary assessment of mood and physical activity in people with depression. So study aim to examine temporal association between physical activity and subsequent mood. People with moderate to severe depression. Let's see how it was measured. Yeah, it was measured using an accelerometer. Had moderate to severe depression, and that one looks good, so keep that one. Next one, depression. So title, depression, and okay, so that's a systematic review. So you don't review reviews. Okay, so immediately that one is gone. Number 3, the association between psychological characteristics of physical activity levels in people with knee osteoarthritis. I'm not interested in anybody other than those with depression. So highlight that. Gone. Depressive symptoms. So this is a prospective cohort study. Physical activity and sedentary behaviour throughout adolescence. I'm interested in adults. So part of my inclusion criteria is people over 18. So gone. And you would just continue in that manner until you've got the studies that you aim to choose. Now, what you need to do is to record that process in this Prisma flowchart. So you've done your preparation. Well, preparation part of it is to download this. It's on Canvas in a Word format. Then do your database search. I've told you about how to do. Include sources like Google Scholar. So the original number, so we had 60 something, so that would go there. And then numbers of papers from non-journal sources. So places like Google Scholar, that would go over here in the right-hand box. So step 4 is really nice because that kind of, typically it almost halves the number of papers you need to look through. So I would always recommend using a citation manager such as EndNote. You can download this through the university, or Mendeley. That's open source, really available. And then at each stage, you just record the number of articles that you've removed. So enter the number of duplicates removed and then what you're left with. And then again, when you hand sort through them, like I just did, record the number that you excluded there. Again, the number that you're left with. And in the eligibility section, then you just do another kind of second check. That's normally done by another researcher, but just you doing this, I'm afraid. So have another little quick look through just to see if you've made any errors. And at the final stage, you should, so if this was me and I was publishing this, I should now access all of the full text articles because up to now, we've not had to. Okay, so don't worry about accessing the full text at all up until this point here. Now, if you're able to do that for most of the studies, that's great. But equally, if you can't, and interlibrary loans is going to take too long, and maybe the journal article itself might cost you 60 quid or something, I don't know, the prices are ridiculous these days, then yeah, don't worry too much about having the full articles. You can still put together a good summary without having access to that. At the end of the day, it's the author's responsibility to make their publication open access, so free to access. It costs about £2, but still it's their responsibility. And so, if I'm short of research funding at any point, then it's my job to go around the faculty and try and scrimp and get together, persuade somebody to, the head of the persuade the head of the faculty to pay for my paper to be open access. And I've always been successful. And then finally, you include the number of studies in your search. Now, deciding on all of those search terms, to try and do all of that before you start searching itself. Of course, have a play around with what studies are returned. But once you've decided on the official search terms, then you really shouldn't go through tweaking the research terms as you go along. That's considered quite unethical. So the search terms that you use to inform all of the Prisma flowchart, all that should be decided prior to, or a priori, which is Latin, and it means prior to. So use 2 or 3 databases as a minimum. Evidence shows that just using Medline, Embase, and the Cochrane collaboration databases produced about 90% of the relevant literature. I don't know whether Embase you've got to pay. If you do, don't bother using it. Don't pay for anything. Things like Sports Discus, PsycInfo, I believe they are free, and yeah, you're fine to use those. And yeah, just yet another reminder. I can't get this through enough to you that the quality of studies in your systematic review, that's what really dictates the quality of the review itself. So the second to last thing you have to do, you're now just about finished, is to carry out data extraction. And this is how I do it. So this is just a template, an Excel template, which is where I record. So this is for my depression and physical activity. Systematic review. So I've got the authors here. I've got the sample size, participant characteristics. Everybody was kind of moderately to severely depressed. But how depression was assessed. Which activity monitor was used. So you'll notice some have favoured one called the Actigraph, which, there's pros and cons to each. The primary outcome measure, which is obviously how physical activity is measured or how it's expressed. So this is moderate to vigorous physical activity, MVPA. This study from 2018 used steps. Why? I don't know. But really difficult to compare with something based on physical activity intensity. So that would be a real discussion point. And obviously, this is just a brief preliminary search, but the summary of findings would be a lot more extensive than this. So, the final part, when you're assembling your discussion, then the mindset you want to maintain is, if the reader were to just remember one thing about my review after reading the discussion, what would it be? And quite often, very often in fact, I might write that down and put it on a post-it note and put it up in front of me when I'm doing the discussion. And that constantly reminds me to stay on track and make sure that everything I put in the review, or in the discussion rather, supports that argument. In terms of how the discussion's set out, just the same as I've always showed you. So paragraph 1, always start off the discussion with, this study aimed to, and then state what it aimed to do. Then say the main findings were, say what the main findings were. And depending on how many main findings you found, then just deal with each one paragraph by paragraph. Just before the end of the discussion, you'll have your strengths and limitations. Now, remember, because in English we read from top to bottom, then put the limitations first, get the bad stuff out of the way. So something like this study did have some limitations. They are blah, 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 but finish strong. And if you finish on the strengths, then that's one of the last things that the reader reads. Because after this, there's just the conclusion and then you're home free. My advice is always you've probably, you've finished the discussion, probably been working for a long time, rather than throwing together something for the conclusion, I would always put your work down, go and do something else, maybe come back the following day. And with a fresh mind, you can then write a nice, short, smooth discussion. The whole idea of which is to leave the reader feeling that they've enjoyed reading your dissertation. That's the purpose of the conclusion. So go to the start of the slide here. If the reader to remember just one thing about my review, that should be stated very clearly in the conclusion. And if you can picture your supervisor, and if you can be pretty certain that they're going to finish reading this and think, oh, that was quite interesting actually, I quite enjoyed that, then you can't do better than that. About as good as you can get. I mentioned at the start of the session that you'll come across systematic reviews, and you'll also come across the systematic review and meta-analysis. Don't worry about these. What a meta-analysis is just some statistics stuck on the end of the systematic review, and it shows numerically the effect size of an intervention or treatment. That's what these boxes show, and you've got the 95% confidence interval as shown on this line, and yeah, don't worry about what it is, what it shows. It's just a numerical way of showing what you've reported in the systematic review. You wouldn't do one of these unless you went on to do a PhD. Okay, so no worries there. So that is how to do a systematic review. So we looked at guidance on systematic reviews, how to put one together, some good tips and tricks on just be confident, go for it, do it well. Highlight some essential resources there on PubMed and search engines, and also on Canvas, how there's a lot of additional information going to be put upon Canvas there. And there'll also be a task for next week. If you could just have a look at that task. It's about study designs. Don't worry, we're not going to drill down and define every study design, because I've done that in multiple modules. What we are going to do is just give a very surface overview of each one, just so that when you are searching the literature, and you're going to do that regardless of what kind of dissertation you do, and you've got to search the literature, you can quickly include or exclude, or decide to or to not read a particular reference that you come across. And you can do that. Looking at the study design is a really good way of doing that. So, week 4, preparation of a systematic review, a little bit of theory in there, but mainly demonstration as to how to do it. And I shall see you in week 5 next time.